Hi Janeites, and welcome back to the What the Austen podcast, and welcome to episode 50! Yay! I'm so excited because I get a Buzzsprout certificate. So if anyone listened to mine and Kaylee's reflection episode, I think last year, I was saying that I was kind of cut off from certificates because you only get them for certain like milestones. But 50 episodes is a milestone, so I'm absolutely chuffed.
Oh my gosh, congratulations! I didn't realize that we're at 50. That's a lot of episodes.
That is a lot of episodes. So if this is the first episode you're listening to, you've got a lot of content you can catch up on for sure. This is the third villain off as well, so happy third year of the villain off.
I'm so excited to get into it.
I'm so excited too. I missed last time's villain off, so I am super, super excited for this one. And congrats on 50. I can't believe it's been 50. That is insane. And yeah, immensely proud of where the podcast has been and where it's going. I mean, yeah, look at this. It's amazing.
I know what's so weird as well is Elle, you were episode number 1 and Kaylee, you were episode number 2. And obviously you've been on loads more, but yeah, it's just cool to reach 50 together.
Yeah, I was literally just thinking that. It just like seemed almost, I don't know, it seems almost not that long ago since we were doing episode 1, but here we are on episode 50. I can't believe it. It's crazy. It's so lovely to see you both as well and celebrate it together.
Oh, I can't believe it was 2 years ago that the three of us were doing the last villain off. It doesn't feel that long.
I know, it's so mental. And also it's October and I love spooky season, so I'm always looking forward to these episodes, you know, villain off, and then I always do the I don't even know what to call it, the Catherine Morland reading list challenge with Martha, where we read one of Catherine Morland's books, which are usually like, it's so long, they're like 600, 800 page books, so that's a trek, but we love it. And that episode's already out, guys, if you haven't heard it. We covered The Monk, so that was the last episode that was out. That was another spooky season episode, so go ahead and check that out if you haven't already. That was a crazy book, but it was fun to discuss with Martha, so I hope you enjoyed that episode as well. And there will be cheat sheets and other content connected to that, just to, you know, if you're never going to read the book, at least you can have the podcast episode and some cheat sheets, and you can get to know Northanger Abbey better through what Catherine weaves, which I kind of love that.
I love that too. I still can't believe you read the entirety of The Mysteries of Udolpho. That was such a commitment.
Yeah, that was
a great episode.
Yeah. That was so crazy.
I have never read it. I feel like I need to, because obviously it's just such a, it's like iconic in the book, isn't it? And yeah, I definitely need to have a look at that, but good for you for getting through all that.
I thought Mysteries of Udolpho was weird though, but The Monk was next level. That was even weirder. Like me and Martha were just, it took us on a different level for sure. But anyway, today's episode is Villain Off, and we have 2 new villains in the hot seat. So today we're going to be covering Lady Catherine from Pride and Prejudice and Mrs Norris from Mansfield Park. So yeah, this is 2 different ones. So first year we did Willoughby and Wickham. Second year we did Caroline Bingley and
Isabella Thorpe.
Isabella Thorpe. Oh my gosh. So I love this because these are slightly different again, you know, older women in these texts, you know, they've got different villain energy. So I'm excited to do this today. Alice, you focused on Lady Catherine. Kaylee, you focused on Mrs Norris, but we'll bridge it and we're going to vote and we're going to see who is the worst based off their actions in the plot, their character traits, and just all around villainness. So I'm looking forward to it, guys.
I thought I'd start off with a little bit of background about Lady Catherine. So in terms of who she is as a person, she's from a very wealthy aristocratic family. There's different clues in the book, which means that we can find out that she's actually the daughter of an earl. Her husband was rich, but he wasn't actually from sort of aristocracy, which is interesting. And you can kind of tell this. I found this out by doing a little bit of research. I don't know if this is true or not, but from what I could see we can see this because so Lady Catherine she continues to use the title of Lady Catherine. She's not Lady de Bourgh, or she's Lady Catherine de Bourgh. So it's like the fact that she's kept the whole Lady Catherine title means that she's still using her sort of family name because she's from that title and that heritage, if that makes sense. So she kind of married slightly down outside her social circle, which again is really interesting when we come on to later things. But she is pretty much a background character. She's got some key scenes throughout the book, which is really interesting. We first hear of her through Mr. Collins, and I think it's chapter 13, he mentions her in the letter he sends to Mr. Bennet when he's coming to visit the Bennet family, and the letter talks a lot about her. So she told him to come down, she'd advise him to marry as soon as he could, and she does it. We sort of see already from the letter he's very involved in Mr. Collins's life. He's obviously a willing recipient, but there's in the letter he talks about the fact that she pays him a visit to his humble parsonage where she had perfectly approved all the alterations he was making and even vouched to suggest some herself. Some shelves in the closet upstairs.
Love it. Love shelves in the closet.
Iconic scene. Happy thought indeed. So there's all these little things already that we're starting to see that she's interfering with.
Lady Catherine is so involved in everybody's life in the parish.
Yeah.
That stood out to me so much. I was like, I kind of like this Flora. She is like, these are my people. I'm going to look after them.
Yeah, this was something that I found out. I mean, later on in the book, there was a quote actually, which I've saved this. So it talks again, later on when I think Lizzie goes to Huntsford to visit Mr. and Mrs. Collins, and it talks a little bit more about her there. And it says how much she's involved in everything that goes on sort of in the village. And there's this amazing quote where you can just imagine her storming into the village to go sort everyone out. And it says she sallied forth into the village to settle their differences, silence their complaints and scold them into harmony and plenty. That's her going into the village and basically sorting everyone out and just having a go at everyone and scolding them all and making sure that they all do exactly what she says. So it is really interesting. Yeah, it's an interesting thing, isn't it?
It's like a matriarchal power, and I kind of feel that. Kaylee, I don't know about you, but I'm like, I love that.
Yeah, I love all of this context that you're giving that I didn't know, and I love that she kept her last name. She's kind of this amazing feminist in a way that I didn't really think about.
Yeah. On the surface, she's actually pretty cool. She's got this massive house. She's just kind of taken on sort of looking after everyone in the village, telling everyone what to do. She's been involved in those small things, which you wouldn't normally think that someone maybe of her social standing would get involved in. But she's kind of a little bit of a girl boss, sort of going in there and sorting it all out, living in her amazing property and everything else. So from the start of it, she seems actually pretty cool. Maybe it's just in the sort of execution of it all, which is not the best in terms of why she might become to see as later on we sort of see her as a bit of a villain in the story, even if she is a bit badass in that respect.
One more thing that I wanted to add that did always strike me about her was I could never understand but loved it that her estate wasn't entailed away from the female line. And so that was one thing that always struck me as unusual because so much of the narrative was around the Bennet's estate being entailed away. And I know we talked about this a bit in another episode too.
I love her statement on that as well, where it actually comes up in conversation and she says I've never understood why this is even a thing. She's like, my estate wasn't entailed away. And I love that she says that in Mr. Collins' presence, because for Mr. Collins, that's something that gives him so much status, so much power that he's going to inherit the Bennet's estate. And obviously that's the reason that pushes him to go and try and marry one of the Bennet sisters and everything. So I kind of love that she says that in his presence, because she doesn't care. She's literally just well, I think that's stupid. I think women should get it in. She's obviously a big advocate for female education. We see that with her being you had no governess and everything. So I'm sure we'll get onto that more in a bit, Elle, but yeah, it's really interesting that even from the offset, we only hear about her in volume 1 from Mr. Collins. And I don't know if you'll chat about the Mr. Wickham one as well, but it's just interesting that we get all this from just hearing about her.
We then hear about her from Mr. Wickham after that. And it is actually Mr. Wickham who discloses to Elizabeth the connection to Mr. Darcy, because this isn't actually apparent in the letter. We just hear about this really, and he paints her in quite a not very good picture. So you've got Mr. Collins, who is maybe over the top in his what's the word? Compliments and what have you, his elegant admiration and just general infatuation, obsession, maybe, I don't know. And then you've got Mr. Wickham, who is found a listener in Elizabeth, who someone to kind of have a little bit of a moan about the Darcy family. And with that, he talks about Lady Catherine and her daughter, and introduces her to her in that light. So we've got two very different pictures of her, but both are not very good, reliable sources. I don't know if you guys had any thoughts.
Is it not masterful how Jane Austen introduces these characters to us? Like, we get this letter about Lady Catherine, totally like random person we've never heard of before. And then it just starts to unravel. We hear from Mr. Wickham there's this link to Mr. Darcy, and nothing that Austen does is like unintentional. Like, everything has a reason, and I just love that.
It's completely deliberate. And at the time, it's interesting because we don't realise what a big part she's going to play in the narrative and later on.
I was just thinking how brilliant it is that we don't meet her off the bat, but we hear about her from Wickham, which I forgot, and then from Mr. Collins. So your idea of her is built up so much, and then when you actually do meet her, hear her condescension. I always love when Collins uses that language. I think it adds kind of this comedic element with how abrasive she is. So I think you're right that Austen did that on purpose, and I think it's really effective.
Yeah, I mean, we get hints from Mr. Collins that although he's very grateful to her, I think it could be seen as quite controlling. Like he says in the letter that she made not the smallest objection to his joining in the society of the neighbourhood, nor to his leaving his parish occasionally for a week or two to visit his relations. He had even condescended to advise him to marry as soon as he could, provided he chose with discretion. So it's like all these little things where she's like, oh yeah, she's allowing him to do this, and that sounds nice, and she's allowing him to do that, and yeah, it's a good idea to do that. And from his perspective, maybe it's coming across as approval, but obviously we don't know. Maybe they've had conversations, and maybe she's actually been quite manipulative, and she's more telling him to do these things, and she's doing it in a way which seems like Mr. Collins has thought of the idea himself, maybe, and it's got approval from her.
Yeah, what is it that Lizzie says? She couldn't bestow her kindness on a more willing
grateful subject. Willing. But yeah, and Lizzie sort of says, I suspect his gratitude actually misleads him, that in spite of her being his patroness, she is arrogant and a conceited woman.
Liz's so judgy. Yeah. Can we just bring that? She actually is so judgy.
It's strong words, isn't it?
I know.
Yeah. Because obviously from me, looking into that letter, that's with hindsight, the fact that we know that maybe later on she could be seen as a very arrogant and controlling woman. But at this point, we don't know anything about her. So it's quite a lot to suddenly just suspect that straight away.
Yeah.
It is interesting. It was pretty telling to me that during Mr. Collins's proposal, he's like, I should have mentioned my first reason that I want to marry you is because of Lady Catherine de Bourgh. And we're like, oh, excuse me.
Yeah,
should that even be a reason? What are you on about?
It's iconic. But the next time we obviously come across her then is later on in the books. And so Lizzie goes to visit her friend after, they've just been married. And so we kind of now wait to see, just as Lizzie does, what it's like to meet Lady Catherine in person. So yeah, they go to the house to have food, to have dinner, and to meet the, Lady Catherine. And it's really funny, they're sort of walking up and Mr. Collins is, reassuring Elizabeth, being like, do not make yourself uneasy, my dear cousin, about your apparel. Lady Catherine is far from requiring that elegance of dress in us, which becomes herself and her daughter. And it's such a backhanded compliment, or a backhanded way of saying, you look nice, you look fine. It's just oh, don't worry about it. You don't have to dress like them because they're way above you, sort of thing.
I love, honestly, there's some absolutely killer comment. There's another one that says she likes to have the distinction of rank preserved.
Yes,
love it.
I mean, that already speaks volumes about her character, doesn't it? So already we know that she's very set in sort of, social rank. And it's just hilarious that it's just full of so many good. With Lady Catherine in Pride and Prejudice, whenever she's involved, I feel like there's just so many good burns the whole way through. It's just amazing.
I love the one, I know we're going to get into what happens once they go round, but I love the one where they're sat at the dinner table and she gets excited about the fact that if they don't know what the dish is, if it's a novelty to them, that makes her really happy because she's oh, I'm introducing you to new things because I'm so wealthy and amazing.
Very quickly, I think I like to talk about the houses in Jane Austen. I think I've done it before in the Emma episode as well. The descriptions of Lady Catherine's house, I think they're very telling with Jane Austen, where she situates characters, the names that she calls houses, what they look like, and how much describes them and things like that. We're told the description of Lady Catherine's house through the eyes of Mr. Collins. He's very pompous. He shows off and he talks constantly about the money, the numbers of things. And whilst the house is not important to the narrative, the way it's compared to Pemberley, for instance, which is the other grand house in Pride and Prejudice, is different. So Rosings is described as a handsome modern building situated on rising ground. So already you've got this impression of it sort of looking down on everyone. It's just a hill with nothing around it, pretty much looking down on everyone. It's a modern house. So that means it was probably built like the middle of the 18th century, then potentially by maybe like a famous architect at the time, such as Robert Adam, those kind of people. But the fact that it's a modern house and built by someone at the time, that means it's very showy. It's all for show. It's been built pretty recently with recent money. It's not an ancestral home in that respect. Although it was her husband's house and it has been there for a while, it's not old in that respect. In comparison to Pemberley, this house is described as handsome, as well proportioned. It's standing well on rising ground, and it's backed by trees and hills. There's a stream. The banks are not formal or falsely adorned, it says in the book. A completely different picture painted compared to the chimney piece, which was £800. The average chimney piece was £300 that era. Apparently, so all these little things which are different. It's in a plainer style. The library has books collected from generations of the family. So this is Pemberley again. The gallery, the long picture gallery. So that kind of speaks potentially the house having Elizabethan or Jacobean sort of heritage in that respect. So there is a history attached to it. It's been there for a while. It's got that ancestral feel. It's got that more homely feel. And for me, like I said, with houses, when it comes to Jane Austen, that speaks a lot about the character. So you've got Lady Catherine living in this house, which is all for show. It doesn't come across as particularly homely at all. And you've got Pemberley in comparison, which is, beautiful and done in a really modest but beautiful way. Tasteful way that still shows off the wealth, but in a good way. And it's funny because there's a quote which Lizzie says really towards the end of the book, when I think when Lady Catherine comes to have a go at her at the end, and she sort of thinks to herself, how could I ever have thought her? How could I ever think her like her nephew? So really that distinction.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting as well to consider. Obviously, at the time, there was a new money, old money dynamic that was starting to build. We see that with Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley.
I think that's such a good point about the old money that's more understated versus new money. And I just kept thinking, oh my gosh, Rosing is Lady Catherine personified, just her sort of in a showy way, condescending to people, standing over them, being very out there. So yeah, I thought that was really important that you brought that up.
I think they actually described the dinner as being, the dinner is described as exceedingly handsome, which is excessive, isn't it? Exceedingly meaning it's almost too much. And she's like loving the fact, like you say, that no one knows what any of the dishes are. She can sort of sit there and be like,
Yeah, Lady Catherine seemed gratified by their excessive admiration and gave most gracious smiles, specifically when any dish on the table was proved a novelty to them. I just love that. That's just her through and through, isn't it?
Yeah. Absolutely. Like, she loves even giving opinions on topics where she has no knowledge. Like, one of my favorite parts is when she's criticizing Elizabeth's piano playing. And then she's like, had I ever learned, I should have been a true proficient.
It's like, love the hypothetical. That's great.
Yeah. This evening, I think, where they're visiting, they talk a lot about the education. I think, like you guys mentioned earlier, when she's talking about the whole governess and everything else, but she basically questions Lizzie loads on her family and her education. Where she's from, how she's brought up, how on earth did her mother bring them up? And she said we didn't have a governess, and she's like, no governess. How is that even possible? If I had known your mother, I should have advised her most strenuously to engage one. Interesting again, like you say, later on when they're playing on the piano and Elizabeth is playing, and she's telling her off for not practicing enough, and they're talking about music, and she's demanding to know what they're all talking about. She's like, what is it you're talking of?
I must have my say in the conversation.
Yes, I must have my say. Honestly, she's so good. Can I say that Lady Catherine in the 1995 adaptation, I think, is my Lady Catherine. She's just amazing in that one. She is absolutely iconic. So she discovers they're talking of music. Then pray, speak aloud. It is of all subjects my delight. If I had ever learned, I should have been a great proficient, and so would Anne if her health had allowed her to apply. And then she says, oh, I've told Miss Bennet several times she will never play really well unless she practices more. I have often told her to come to Rosings every day and play on the pianoforte in Mrs. Jenkinson's room, which is the governess. She would be in nobody's way, you know, in that part of the house. It's so rude. It's like you think she's going to say, oh yeah, come and play on the piano here. But it's like, no, in Mrs. Jenkinson's room and go over there. But what's I find the most interesting about this is the fact that Lady Catherine doesn't actually play. She has no musical ability. Neither does her daughter. And she sits there telling everyone that they need to do this, that, and the other. You should be practicing more and you need to make sure that you can play better. And it also reminds me of the conversation that Mr. Darcy has with Caroline Bingley about the whole what is an accomplished woman. And, you know, they've got to play and sing and do all this. And I find it really interesting that Lady Catherine doesn't. And I couldn't really find out why. I don't think I've really looked into it enough. But I don't know if you both had any thoughts on that at all either.
I think this is the same with the education as well, because even though she hamps on about education, it's not actually perfectly clear how well educated she actually is. We can assume that she had private education. I think part of the conversation is a societal conversation of the time where people were debating whether or not private education was superior, and a lot of people being against like boarding schools and women having an education, which is really interesting because Jane Austen and her sister Cassandra actually went to a boarding school in Reading. So for Jane Austen, obviously female education, even though that was really encouraged by her father at the time, it was a real like debate with people. And I love that Lady Catherine talks about this stuff, but we never actually hear like that she's accomplished in that. Is she really well educated? We're not 100% sure, but we assume so. She can't play the piano. We don't hear of anything else that she's like particularly really well versed in. So it's interesting that she's got all these assumptions of an accomplished lady, but yet we don't see any evidence that she herself is one.
Totally. The audacity to give all of this criticism and advice when you don't have anything to back it up yourself is absurd. And Ellis, I loved that point where you mentioned that Mr. Darcy talks about all of the criteria for an accomplished woman, and then his very wealthy relative doesn't have anything to back it up and is extremely socially inappropriate. So I just think that's such great justice for Lizzie, because he's talking so much about how embarrassing her relatives are when she, in a lot of ways, is a very embarrassing.
100%. 100%. That is such a good point, especially when we talked earlier about the whole social thing. You know, is it because they're obviously more well off and they're higher up in the social standings, they get away with it more? Whereas you look at someone like Mrs. Bennet, okay, she's married to a gentleman, but because he behaves like he does, he doesn't get away with the eccentricities that Lady Catherine does.
Yes, yeah. And again, on the education, I'm just thinking about it. We do see a governess situation for Anne, but what do we see of Anne? Anne never says anything. She sits there. She's really sickly. She obviously isn't living her best life, is she? And Lady Catherine's whole aim for her, she can't play the piano. Lady Catherine's whole aim for her is to marry Mr. Darcy. So she has a private education, and yet we see no evidence that that in itself is being, successful.
Right. And then remember how much flack the gardeners got. Everyone was looking down on the gardeners because of their connections, and then they end up being so wonderful and normal and respected by Mr. Darcy. So there's so many things that are happening here with the embarrassing relatives that, I don't know, I just think it's genius of Jane Austen.
That's so good. I've never really thought about that so much in that respect. I love that point, Kaylee, that you've brought up and really dug into that, because I never even thought about that properly until we sort of started to delve into Lady Catherine a bit more. Also, the other interesting thing, I've just noticed a quote on here that Lady Catherine mentions is, she says, when my niece Georgiana went to Ramsgate last summer, I made a point of her having 2 men servants to go with her, because she's talking about them travelling properly when they go home. That I found really interesting, because obviously we all know
situation.
Yes, we all knew what happened at Ramsgate. I've not noticed that before. So she knew she'd gone, and she thought she'd properly attended to Georgiana. So this is Mr. Darcy's sister who went to Ramsgate, and this is why Mr. Wickham obviously tried to elope and run off, and all of this is comes out. So it's really interesting, which I find it really funny, because she's like, oh yeah, I was able to make sure that she was attended properly and nothing bad happened. And then we're all like, well, we all know what actually went down and you haven't got a clue. So you're sat here, you know, saying, oh, I'll do this and you need to do this and I'll make sure you're attended properly and you need to act in this way. When actually she's not realised that her, you know, 16-year-old niece nearly eloped and was absolutely ruined in Ramsgate. Which she would have had, like, obviously some say over by the sounds of it, and making sure that, she was down there and properly attended to. But it turns out that, you know, scandal was close from happening.
Yeah, this is like a little bit of a sidetrack, but it kind of links onto my Lydia Bennet episode that I did not so long ago. I don't think there was any way, I mean, even now, there is no way to truly protect a woman in society, let's be clear, because Georgiana has two guardians, Darcy and Fitzwilliam. She obviously has Lady Catherine looking after it, and someone like Wickham can still come in and still try and, you know, ruin her life. And I just think there's just no, and it was the same for, obviously the same thing happened for Lydia, and Lydia unfortunately didn't have the same, you know, connections to have so many people looking out for her, but she was under the protection of another family and it still happened. I know that's a sidetrack, guys, but I just think it's just really interesting how, you know, unsafe women were then and still are now. Let's be clear.
Yeah, really definitely, 100%. Towards the end of the book, so it's just after Elizabeth's sister Jane has now engaged to Mr. Bingley happily. So yeah, this is a great scene when Lady Catherine turns up to the Bennet's house. So she's heard of this report. She stormed down to Longbourn to question Elizabeth about her intentions, or Mr. Darcy's intentions with Elizabeth. And she's sort of like, well, that lady, I suppose, is your mother, when she sees Elizabeth's mother and things like that. And that, I suppose, is your sister. Elizabeth and Lady Catherine go into the garden. She starts to talk to Elizabeth about how much of the match between her and Mr. Darcy is just completely outrageous. She starts off, like I say, you know, you ought to know that I'm not to be trifled with. My character has ever been celebrated for its sincerity and frankness, which I found was interesting because Elizabeth Bennet is also described often as being frank, but it's two completely contrasting characters and not delivered again. As I say with Lady Catherine, I think it's the execution of these things. On the surface, on paper, she seems really cool and very strong and independent, but the way she delivers it and her intentions, for me, is why she's just not a good person. The way she does it doesn't come from a good place. So she talks about the report of an alarming nature reaching her. She knows it must be a scandalous falsehood, so she's talking about the engagement. And she says, you know, your arts and allurements made in a moment of infatuation have made him forget what he owes to himself and his family. She goes, you know, Miss Bennet, do you know who I am? It's just ridiculous, the amount of things she says. But I've just put page 400 is fab. Like, it has just got all these amazing lines of being like, you know, because honour, decorum, prudence, nay, interest forbid it. So she's talking about all these different things. And she goes, the classic line as well, obstinate, headstrong girl, I am ashamed of you. Like, it's just,
I am ashamed of you.
Yeah,
you know who I am.
You know who I am. And then the best quote for me, the first bit where obviously she stands in the 1995 adaptation, she sort of stands on the step. And at the end, and she sort of goes, heavens and earth, of what are you thinking? Are the shades of Pemberley to be thus polluted? And she's sort of waving her arms in the air like some
stick in the
mad
air.
lady. Yeah, that's it. Unfeeling, selfish girl. And then the best thing for me is obviously get back to the house, and she just goes, I send no compliments to your mother. You deserve no such attention. I am most seriously displeased. I think it's just such the biggest, like, Regency burn to be like, yeah, I send no compliments to your mother. Like, that's it. We're done.
I knew you were going to say
it's that one. I don't know why. I just love it.
I was like bracing myself for you to say, "Oh, the shades of Pemberley to be thus polluted."
Oh God, this whole scene's just absolutely genius.
It's incredible, the whole thing.
I think I might start saying to people, like, if they get on my nerves, I might just be like going up to them and just be like, "Oh, I send no compliments to your mother."
Like, start signing. You could start signing off emails like that at work instead of being like, kind regards. It's like, I send no compliments to your mother. You deserve no such attention.
Something else that comes up in this, like, section with Lady Catherine that honestly sticks with me as well is the whole monologue she goes on about Anne, and how her and Mr. Darcy were, like, planned, like, their union was planned when they were in cradles. I'm like, that's so creepy. I remember I had a conversation once with, like, someone when I was younger. I had feelings for this guy and I really liked him. and she was like old friends with him. And she said something really similar to me, gave me full Lady Catherine like vibes. She was literally just like, oh yeah, well, you know, like we've known each other forever, basically like your union's been planned since the cradle. And I was just like, I'm not being funny, but what is this? Are we courting in Tudor England? Like, what are you on?
A little bit of a whistle-stop tour on Lady Catherine and her key scenes, her best quotes, and just sort of, for me, like I say, why she is a villain in Austen's sense is because, like, you know, I said earlier, I think on the surface she looks like she could be a really great character. She's got all the makings of someone who could be really influential in a good way in someone's life, and you know, she wants to take it upon herself to help people, but is she really helping people? It's not coming from a good place. For me, a lot of it comes from trying to control, trying to meddle, and she could use her status, use her power, and use this need to want to get involved in people's lives in a much more positive and healthy and just wholesome way, and be there to support her family, to be there to support, you know, Mr. Collins also in a better way. I think she manipulates him.
You're blowing my mind with some of the details that I feel like I've overlooked in the past, like the fact that she knew about Georgiana and Wickham, and it's confirmed. And because when I've thought about Lady Catherine, I've thought before, okay, well, you always know what you're getting with her. She's super controlling and meddles, but she does it openly. And sure, she manipulates Mr. Collins, but you see her doing that in front of everyone. Like it's very obvious, whereas others are sneakier and more behind the scenes. But I think there were a bunch of different parts that you mentioned that made me think that Lady Catherine is actually much more calculated and manipulative than I was giving her credit for.
Yeah,
I think she knew about the Georgiana situation though, because I feel like Darcy says that the only you can confirm this through Fitzwilliam, like he was the only other person to know. But I think what's funny is Lady Catherine says this, not realizing that the same things happened under her nose.
I think that's what it was. I don't think she knew what had happened, but it's the fact she sits there boasting about the fact that, you know, when Georgiana went away, it was done so well and correctly, and that's what she believes. And it's just like, oh, you don't know half of it. You don't know actually what went on, and it's embarrassing, maybe in hindsight, for you to sit there and say all that when there are people who know.
My devil's advocate thing with her being like, obviously needing to have her fingers in every single pie, is she says a quote at one point where she says, "I believe nobody feels the loss of friends so much as I do." So my devil's advocate thing that I'll put out there is maybe she's actually really lonely. Like, her daughter doesn't say anything. She lives in this big house. She's got the governess, but the fact that she has people like the Collinses around all the time, the fact that she does get so heavily involved into her own parish, even though really she doesn't necessarily have to, I'd say maybe she's like bored and lonely, and like she just wants to find ways to spend her time.
One thing that I appreciate about Lady Catherine more is I do think, even though she is controlling and meddlesome and interferes in people's lives in an inappropriate way, I do think, even if it's serving the purpose of making her feel better about herself, I do think she does try to step in and help people, right? Like she does offer to have her man attend Lizzie on the trip back. She does say that Lizzie can practice the piano at her home. Like, she is doing, I mean, it's so absurd.
I know what you mean. She does try, but for me, they've always got like a slight thing to it. Like when she offers the piano, it's like, oh, you can, but you've got to go sit in that part of the house. Oh, I can take you home in my carriage, but I've actually only got room for one of you. She says, I can only attend one of you. But if it cools, and she said, if it cools down, then maybe we could have both of you because you're not very big, so it's okay. I think she says something along those lines. So it's always got like, she says something, and then she almost like, you get slapped in the face with just this sort of like, oh, well, why did you say that? If you'd have just stopped there, then it would have been nice. But she continues and says something else and just makes it worse every time.
Yeah. And even her like repairing certain things, like, is it that she's doing nice things for the parish, or is it that for her appearances are so important that she has to have her parish upkept all the time? And also she wants to be in a position where everybody brags and boasts about everything that she's done for the parish. Oh, she put shelves in my closet. You know, happy thought indeed.
Happy thought indeed. And the way of sorting things out, she bulldozes in and goes and starts to bully people into submission, which is what she tries to do with Elizabeth. She doesn't get it. It's what she tries to do with the people in her parish.
Lady Catherine meets her match with Elizabeth. not sure Mrs. Norris meets her match with Fanny in terms of ways that she's able to stand up for herself in comparison. So, Kaylee, over to you.
Oh my gosh. So, Mrs. Norris, I think the first thing to say about her that's really important is to think about her birth order. So she's the eldest of the 3 Ward sisters. And I think before I never really noticed or put too much attention to the fact that she's older than Lady Bertram, but I think that's extremely important and explains a lot of her meddling and controlling and resentful nature. So basically, Mrs. Norris ends up marrying a reverend, and which is respectable, but she's very fixated on money and wealth. And it's highly insinuated that Lady Bertram marries above her status, right? Like she's really lucky to marry Sir Tom Bertram and live at Mansfield Park. And so it's very interesting to see how Jane Austen opens the novel with explaining that Lady Bertram was the one who won out. Mrs. Norris married okay. And then there's that quotation that says, even though they were all equal attractiveness levels, there aren't as many well-off, wealthy men as there are pretty girls who deserve them. So you can tell very much Lady Bertram got the gold, and then Mrs. Norris is settling and then ends up living with her husband on the estate. And then the third daughter, the youngest, marries this naval lieutenant. And while Lady Bertram goes, oh, well, yeah, okay, let's just never talk to her again. Let's cut her off because he's considered lower standing. Mrs. Norris really is out to get the younger sister. She writes her a really angry letter, cutting her off, saying what a disgrace everything is to the family. So it's very early on established that she cares a lot about wealth and that the youngest sister is a disgrace.
Yes,
that was one thing I
it.
picked up too, yeah, when I was kind of just briefly looking at the fact. I had sort of forgotten that she was the eldest sister as well, and so it's interesting then that maybe she feels that maybe she should have been the one to have done that and had that responsibility. Obviously it's given to, for example, in Pride and Prejudice, Jane sort of got that responsibility. So yeah, I don't know whether that does cause resentment, but yeah, go for it, Izzy.
That just made me think as well, you know, Jane, like, had the tables been different, had Bingley never been on the scene, Jane would have had to marry Mr. Collins. She would have been in a very similar situation as Mrs. Norris. And also, do you not think this whole thing is why Mrs. Norris is like so obsessed with Maria? Like, Maria's like her redemption. She's like, I will make sure that Maria marries Mr. Rushworth, the wealthiest man, because, you know, I'm going to fix my error that I wasn't able to do this through Maria. Like, she just lives vicariously through her.
Absolutely. That's such a good point. She lives vicariously through her, and then everything is about Mr. Rushworth being this incredible catch because he's so wealthy. And we've talked before on different podcast episodes about how he is the wealthiest Austen man. He's wealthier than Mr. Darcy. And Mrs. Norris isn't able to see how stupid he is and how actually they're not a good fit because she's so laser focused on that. And when you said that, Izzy, too, they mention how Maria is lacking in a lot of the really important moral qualities that Fanny has, and Mrs. Norris just doesn't value that or see that. So Maria is her gem.
Also, something that's really grim about Mrs. Norris as well is she holds no value to love. Like, she's so against her younger sister for marrying for love, and obviously writes a horrible letter. And then again, it's all just money focused. And obviously that creates this difference between her and Fanny, because Fanny's very love focused. But yeah, just a bit gross, isn't it? All the money and status focus that Mrs. Norris has. Don't like it.
Yes. And also just sort of preserving her image and saying things about herself that are completely hypocritical. And, you know, like, I just, at the beginning, she puts on such a facade, and I get so angry at her right away because basically the youngest sister reaches out and says, I'm overwhelmed. I have so many kids. I really need help. And Thomas Bertram is hesitant to take a kid. He's like, we really need to think about this because we want to make sure that we give this kid a good quality of life. And then Mrs. Norris goes, oh, I feel so bad. We need to do more for our sister. And the fact that she convinces him to take Fanny in and says, I'll go get her myself. I don't have my own children, so I will do most of the rearing. I just want a little bit of your help. And then flip-flops is just unbelievable to me. I remember thinking right away, I got kind of like the spidey senses. I was like, something is off about this lady.
Oh my God. Yeah. Do you know what? Like when I was reading that this time, what really creeped me out is I was like, I think she sees Fanny is like the replacement for her, because at the moment she's at the bottom of the pecking order and she's like, I need someone below me. So let's take Fanny in. She's perfect.
That's super interesting. That's a really good point. Yeah.
I think I was so distracted by the youngest sister who lives with the naval lieutenant being, at the bottom of the totem pole that I forgot that within Mansfield, you're right, that Mrs. Norris is, she's the least wealthy. She's the one who's receiving more charity. So Fanny becomes the scapegoat, which makes so much sense. I just wanted to share a few quotes here that show how much she manipulates and gaslights Thomas Bertram and misleads. She's one to offer promises and then there's no follow through and burdens other people. So she initially says, if you are not against it, I will write to my poor sister tomorrow and make the proposal to get Fanny. And as soon as the matters are settled, I will engage to get the child to Mansfield. You shall have no trouble about it. My own trouble, I never regard. She also totally makes herself a victim. And then, a paragraph or two later, Mrs. Norris had not the least intention of being at any expense whatever in her maintenance. Nobody knew better how to dictate liberality to others, but her love of money was equal to her love of directing. And she knew quite well how to save her own as to spend that of her friends. I just thought that was such a good summary of her character.
Oh, it's just gross, isn't it? She's so inauthentic and just so money obsessed, so superficial. Oh, it makes my skin crawl thinking about somebody like that. Just awful. Terrible energy.
It's just amusing me watching your facial reaction, Izzy, as kids reading out these quotes. It's like, they're just
my God, these people exist.
Happy Halloween.
It's like the spooky episode. Terrifying.
Yeah.
It's his worst nightmare, the inauthentic.
Yeah, Mrs. Norris, inauthentic. Coming through.
That was so amazing because I was like, my spidey senses, that feeling. And then Izzy, you were describing that feeling. And I was like, Halloween, spooky. That was amazing. Oh my God.
Yeah.
I loved that. Okay. So then Lady Bertram says, where shall the child come to first, sister, to you or to us? And then Sir Thomas heard with some surprise that it would be totally out of Mrs. Norris's power to take any share in the personal charge of her. And that she convinces him too. What? Oh, I could never do that. And then has a million different excuses that aren't true. That very strong intro to her hypocrisy. And then as the book goes on, Fanny arrives, and Fanny very understandably is upset. She's sad to miss her family. She doesn't feel comfortable. And Mrs. Norris, where I think she's a villain, is I think she demonstrates a lot of sociopathy. Like, she cannot seem to empathize with anyone's emotions. Of course, Fanny is going to be upset and scared and need to adjust, but Mrs. Norris chastises her and vilifies her right away.
Is this the bit where she says, I hope Fanny will be sensible of her uncommon good fortune or something like that? And it's like, what?
Oh.
How will you become sensible of your uncommon good fortune, Mrs. Norris? How cruel. She's like, what's she, 5? She's a child.
She is so harsh. Like, I didn't even know where to start with which comments to pull because she is constantly so harsh to Fanny. So Fanny's tired and sad. And as soon as she leaves the room, Mrs. Norris goes, this is not a promising beginning. I thought she would have behaved better. I wish there may not be a little sulkiness of temper. Yeah.
It's horrible, isn't it? Because it's like the first time as well that I think in Austen's work where someone's being really horrible to a child as well. The fact that she's obviously a child, she's not even a grown woman, and so it just makes it all the more worse for me, I think.
Yeah, it feels so Victorian, so Bronte or Dickens.
Yes, it does, doesn't it?
It's very much a dynamic that even though Mrs. Norris was the one who wanted to bring Fanny into the family, right away Fanny is treated like a second-class citizen. Constantly, I think where it reminds me of Cinderella is constantly Mrs. Norris goes out to the Rushworths, to a lot of different places, and nobody has a problem with Fanny coming, but she always says, Fanny, stay behind. Fanny, I have all these chores for you to do. Even though Lady Bertram is constantly lounging around with her pug, the one time that Fanny has a headache and is lying on the couch, she starts chastising her in a very, very mean way and calls her lethargic. She pretty much every moment she gets, she's either criticizing Fanny or isolating her from everyone else and reminding her of her inferior status.
Yes. It's very extreme considering Mrs. Norris herself is nobody special in this household, let's be clear, because she's pretty much scrounging off the Bertrams anyway. She lives in a house that they've given her, I think it's called like White House or something. And she's basically with them 24/7. She has no children of her own. Her husband has died, so she can't have that many expenses in life. And her motive in life is to just make Fanny's life miserable. I think it's so sad because the polarity between the two of them, Fanny being so soft and kind, a little bit docile sometimes, and then Mrs. Norris being this just outspoken in the worst kind of way, cruel, just negative person.
It's almost like she's punishing her for some reason, for almost the fact that she's poor and it's not her fault. And like you say, it's that thing of like she's trying to exert her authority and trying not to be the lowest in the pecking order by then punishing this other poor person for being poor.
Like she's projecting all of her own insecurities in the worst kind of way. I mean, so cruel about it.
Right. And there's nothing that really prompts it. Like we can even, with Lady Catherine, she's so mean to Elizabeth when in the Are the Shades of Pemberley to be thus polluted scene. But she's upset, right? Because she had this dream of Anne and Darcy getting together, right? So there's something there that's a catalyst for that. Whereas Mrs. Norris is just out of the blue. Fanny will walk into her room and she'll start criticizing her appearance, sending her out to do all of these chores. So anyway, yeah, so she's not kind to her. That's the dynamic. And then the original agreement is that eventually she's going to take charge of Fanny. And so when Fanny's 15, and her husband, Mrs. Norris's husband, passes away, she moves to a smaller house, and that's the time where they're thinking, okay, she's going to take Fanny now. Mrs. Norris is not especially aggrieved by her husband's death, but regrets the smaller income she will receive now that he's dead. I found it really funny that she was not sad about her husband's passing at all. She was just more worried about the financial piece. And here's the quote. Mrs. Norris, on quitting the parsonage, removed first to the park and afterwards to a small house of Sir Thomas's in the village, and consoled herself for the loss of her husband by considering that she could do very well without him, and for her reduction of income by the evident necessity of stricter economy. So she's fine with him gone, and then it's an excuse that she has to economize so she can't take on Fanny.
Oh my God, she's just the worst. Oh my God, that's just an awful thing to say. I can't. I'm terrified.
And then actually, Fanny's reaction when she finds out she might live with Mrs. Norris is really interesting too, because Edmund's trying to convince her it'll be a great idea. And she's just like, Edmund, I can't agree with you on that one. And yeah, so luckily.
Oh my God. What does Edmund say that's sensible? Honestly, the guy grates on me. I can't.
He is so... Oh my gosh, here it is. Okay. Edmund, okay. She is of a temper... So this is Edmund talking about Mrs. Norris to Fanny. She's of a temper to do a great deal for anybody she really interests herself about. And then Fanny, I always thought Fanny was a pushover, and she is at times, but here she goes, Fanny's side. I cannot see things as you do. if I could suppose my aunt to really care for me, it would be delightful to feel myself as of consequence to anybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How many times does Fanny say the truth to Edmund and Edmund's just, his head is in the clouds? But also, what is he on about? Because he's the one person who literally has arguments with Mrs. Norris the most. He's really rude to her. Like, I know she's horrible and, like, you know, probably deserves it, but he's really goes at her sometimes.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Isn't he the one that stands up for her a lot when Mrs. Norris, you know, is chastising her and everything else? That's really odd. He annoys me like you.
Yeah, I know. That's what I remembered too, because I think there are more parts where Edmund is really horrified by how Mrs. Norris treats her. Like, she makes a big deal about Fanny. It's not appropriate for Fanny to have a horse, and she's very much trying to neglect Fanny's needs, and then Edmund will get upset and stand up for her.
Yeah. What's really disturbing to me about Mrs. Norris as well is the fact that she does this in public. She's not afraid to do this because she does it in front of the Crawfords as well, because there's one time where Mary's actually disturbed with the way that Mrs. Norris treats Fanny, and she says, like, oh, Fanny, like, come over here, let us not worry about those people, like, you know, tries to comfort her and talk to her about something else, because she can see how visibly distressed Fanny is from Mrs. Norris's actions and, like, her words and how cruel she is. And I think there's one thing being, like, a cruel person and doing it secretly because you know that actually what you're doing is really horrible. But it's that she's so oblivious that what she's doing is so cruel and so wrong that she does it in front of strangers, essentially, and friends and people who don't live in the household.
I know. And it's like, are you oblivious, or is this a weird power trip to make someone else look terrible so that you feel more important?
Yeah. I wonder if it's that, Kaylee, actually, and the fact that she's trying to make someone feel worse so that she feels better about herself. Like you said earlier, is about putting her insecurities on someone else, and it just, like, makes it all the more worse that this supposedly brought in Fanny out of the goodness of her heart, but she's brought her in just to be, again, the intention is not there, like I guess with Lady Catherine. She's trying to show that she's being charitable, but I don't think that the real intention or the heart was there behind it. It's just horrible. And I like the fact you brought the horse thing as well, because I was looking through that literally just before we came on the recording, because she's so horrible about the horse. Fanny is not allowed to have a horse, and she has to sit at home whilst her cousins go out riding their horses, and she's got to sit there and, like, be like, oh, I'll sit here and watch everyone else having fun.
Yeah, which is really sad because Fanny really enjoys riding as well.
No, it's horrible. Yeah, whenever I think back to the fact that Mrs. Norris was the one who initiated Fanny coming, I always think, what is going on? Because, again, nobody else has a problem as Fanny grows up and they really get to know her with having her around, but Mrs. Norris is always the one who keeps her back. And, for example, she was invited to a dinner, and Fanny ended up being able to go, and Mrs. Norris, there were so many mean quotations, but this was the one that really got me. Mrs. Norris says to Fanny, I do beseech and entreat you not to be putting yourself forward and talking and giving your opinion as if you were one of your cousins. That will never do, believe me. Remember, wherever you are, you must be the lowest and last. She literally says that to her. As the plot moves forward, every interaction with Mrs. Norris and Fanny is negative. But what ends up happening is it's very clear that, like you said, Izzy, Mrs. Norris's favorite is Maria. And so she's setting up Maria with Mr. Rushworth, and she thinks she's doing such a great job playing matchmaker. And it's sort of understood that those two are going to be together. And then, as we know, there's a lot of drama that occurs with that, where Maria and Mr. Rushworth are not a good fit. And a lot of this has to do with Sir Thomas and his oldest son, Tom, leaving for Antigua. And while they're in Antigua, the infamous play happens. And while Sir Thomas is gone, Mrs. Norris is supposed to be kind of holding down the fort with being the moral guide, because Lady Bertram doesn't care about anything except her pug. And very much, do you like how I'm summarizing this?
That's like also a good Halloween couple's costume. I'll go have, like, the pug and Mrs. Norris. Ladybug.
I can dress Hoggy up as a pug, and I'll go as Lady
and then go as Lady Bertram.
The amount she is so concerned about her pug is in the story is so ridiculous.
I feel like I'm laughing at this, but that's literally me and Hoggy. Like, I'm literally just like, this is my child, so... But then I don't have other children, so it's not so neglectful as it is for Lady Bertram.
I feel like you would like your children too, whereas Lady Bertram is like, oh, my pug, and then kind of forgets Fanny exists. But yeah, so Mrs. Norris is the one who says that she very much says that the play is a great idea and shames Fanny a lot for hesitating to do the play. So she says, when Fanny says, I'm uncomfortable with this, I don't think it's moral, I don't think Sir Thomas would approve. She says, I'm quite ashamed of you, Fanny, to make such a difficulty of obliging your cousins in a trifle of this sort, so kind as they are to you. Take the part with a good grace and let us hear no more of the matter, I entreat. And then Edmund defends her and she goes, I'm not going to urge her, replied Mrs. Norris sharply, but I shall think her a very obstinate, ungrateful girl if she does not do what her aunt and cousins wish her. Very ungrateful indeed, considering who and what she is. I had to do that.
What?
Because she's so mean, but also because we're comparing her to Lady Catherine, it sounded like obstinate, headstrong girl. I'm ashamed. It's kind of the same vibe there.
Yes, but directed at such different people and for such different reasons. Fanny hasn't done anything to bring that kind of criticism, whereas Elizabeth is headstrong and she does, say her piece. So I think that's just awful. But who or what? Is that what she says? Who or what she is?
Yes.
Oh my god, this is like convincing me to do some sort of like defense of Fanny, because I'm not always the biggest fan of Fanny, but now I'm like feeling just like horrific seeing it from this perspective.
I quite like Fanny. I'm just gonna put her out there. Like, as I know she's not like a really strong independent character like maybe Elizabeth, but I think there's something to be said sometimes about I think we should I think she's dealing with a very difficult situation, especially when we have someone like Mrs. Norris like constantly saying all these horrible things, which I mean could be like put down as almost like emotional abuse. You know what I mean? The things that she's saying to her is awful. Yeah. And it's interesting in comparison, like you say, to Lady Catherine. They're very fixated on sort of class and ranking and people being in their place and things like that. But it's just really interesting. I just think Mrs. Norris is so much more vile with it, and especially when she doesn't have obviously Lady Catherine's status as well. That's interesting too, that she feels it's up to her to throw this around. And also why leave her in charge when everyone else made that decision? I say the worst decision.
Is that the difference then? Is like a significant difference in terms of how you treat people? I know this sounds really bad because it shouldn't matter your status to how you treat people. You should treat everybody well. But in terms of like perceiving it worse, is it worse because Mrs. Norris is actually herself not of high status? So it's literally just
no, because when the final scene with Elizabeth and Lady Catherine, when she's throwing all these insults, like they're horrible as well. Like they are, she's calling her a horrible selfish girl. She barely even knows her, and she's throwing all these insults out. So I mean, she's pretty vile as well. But I don't know what it is, like you say, about Mrs. Norris, where I do think she's worse. Like, they're both similar because of the casting, and they like people in their place, and they're really quick to sort of throw insults out and manipulate people and tell people what to do. But Mrs. Norris does it. I think the fact that she just goes in on Fanny, on this one person, and she really like bullies her, and she properly bullies her and makes her like the object of kind of her own insecurities and throwing all these things on. I think Lady Catherine just sort of does it to everyone. I don't know. It's the fact that it's this targeted abuse, I think, for me, which really, really gets to me.
So, but obviously, Lady Catherine targets Elizabeth as well. Yeah. Is it because Elizabeth is able to stand up for herself, whereas Fanny can't or Fanny doesn't? Is that what makes it so much worse? Because it's so uncomfortable to see somebody being berated when they don't say anything back and they're just taking it and they're just like, oh, this is awful, I've just got to live with this. Whereas we don't feel so bad for Elizabeth because she turns around and she's literally just like, I'm not being funny, but if your nephew wants to marry me, he wants to marry me, that's just it, you'll have to live with it.
Maybe it's because I guess she brought Fanny in the first place. It was her doing, where I guess Lady Catherine didn't have an influence on Elizabeth's decisions and what she was doing and where she was going, whereas the fact that she brought her in and was supposed to be charitable to her and then sort of turned it around and made it awful, I don't know whether that's part of it as well. Yeah.
I have so many different thoughts about this, because I think it's a fair point that I think Lady Catherine would treat any woman the way that she treats Elizabeth, because she's so invested in Anne marrying Darcy. So I think that's the reason it comes out so meanly and harshly, and it's not excusable, but she does have a reason. Whereas I think no matter what Fanny did, Mrs. Norris treats her specifically and her alone this way. She scapegoats her, whereas I think Lady Catherine treats everyone pretty badly. But I do think, I think it is a really good point, though, that Elizabeth can take Lady Catherine, just like you said, Izzy, like she can stand up for herself. And so we're like, all right, you got her. It's not so bad. Elizabeth, we know you're going to be okay. Whereas Fanny doesn't stand up for herself. So maybe the bullying does feel that much more intense.
And there's no one to protect Fanny either. Whereas Elizabeth has got a really strong family behind her, and her sisters as well, and her father. And she's got that family network. But actually, I think Fanny is pretty much alone. I mean, yeah, she has Edmund sticking up for her every so often. But I mean,
occasionally when he's not invested in Mary.
Exactly. Yeah, but Fanny has no support, so she's really vulnerable, like really vulnerable.
I know that we're going in on Mrs. Norris now, but also that makes me hate Edmund all the more, because why not give her the support, that backing to be like, no, Fanny, you stick up for yourself? Because how much easier is it for Elizabeth to turn around to Lady Catherine and be like, I am not going to make any promises that I'm not going to marry your nephew because I secretly want to, because she knows that Darcy's in love with her, right? Having that backing, having that reassurance, that validation that you can say, like, I know he would choose me beyond. And she says, like, even if his whole family liked me, it still would make no difference to my decision. I would still marry him because I want to. And I think that's so much easier though when you've got somebody, when you know that person also feels the same way. Because saying that if she's just like, I don't know, he might propose to me, I might say yes, I might say no. Like, you wouldn't be so invested in it. You wouldn't have that gumption to be like, no, I'm not promising anything.
Agreed. I think it just made me think as well, that point we made earlier about back in Emma, you know, when they tell Emma off, or Mr. Knightley tells Emma off for being horrible to Miss Bates. Again, it's because she's in a really vulnerable position. She's really poor. She's vulnerable. It's not okay to make fun of someone who hasn't got the backing and the standing behind them. It's a similar thing, I think, then with Fanny. She is also in a similar position where she doesn't have anything to support her, family, wealth, friends, anything. And Mrs. Norris is doing exactly what Mr. Knightley was telling Emma off for doing.
True. And when you say that, you know, Fanny is in a more vulnerable position where she doesn't have as much family support as, say, Elizabeth, I think about when William actually does come and visit, and then they arrange that trip together. And Mrs. Norris is such a pill about it, and she starts getting very resentful that Sir Thomas is going to give William some money for the travels. And when she sees that, that's when she offers, do you remember, she thinks about going with them, and it's only when it's concerning money. So she doesn't care at all about Fanny connecting with her family at all. If anything, it's an imposition. But then as soon as money is involved, she's suddenly interested.
Yeah, it's so gross. She just feels so... Mrs. Norris, I think, sees herself as this victim. She's so downtrodden. I couldn't marry for love. Also, I couldn't marry for money. And then all these people have, like, you know, family connections that are wonderful. I don't have that. It's like she lives in such a place of lack that it's like if anybody has even the smallest amount of happiness, she has to crush it because she can't bear to see that happen unless it's going to benefit her, which is the whole thing with Mariah as well. It's not about Mariah. It's that she's thinking, well, if Mariah marries Mr. Rushworth and I'm, you know, bestest buds with Mariah, then I can go and live with them and I'll have even more money than I did living with the Bertrams. So,
yes, it's always her. She's just such a schemer, right? She schemes so much. And actually, she also, I think she'll do anything. I think she has a pathological need for attention where she's calling the shots. She's telling the story. Do you remember, I actually think this is one of the creepiest parts, in chapter 4, when Sir Thomas and Tom are leaving for Antigua, she starts having these fantasies that they're going to die and that she's going to be the one to tell everyone. Oh my gosh.
Oh,
No, now you're saying that, that does. I haven't reread it properly for a while. Obviously, I was flicking through earlier, but like that, I do. Yeah, I remember something like that happening. Like that is weird. It's awful and dark.
It's sociopathic. Oh my gosh. Okay, I like had kind of forgotten about that part.
Did you have quotes of this? I'm so disturbed.
Oh my gosh,
We need evidence now.
And again, there are some ellipses in this. I didn't want to put too much, but I pulled out the most, just some important chunks. So Mrs. Norris had been indulging in very dreadful fears and trying to make Edmund participate in them. And she depended on being the first person made acquainted with any fatal catastrophe. She had already arranged the manner of breaking it to all the others when Sir Thomas's assurances of their both being alive and well made it necessary to lay by her agitation and affectionate preparatory speeches for a while. So they keep coming back to the fact that she's planning, oh my gosh, it's going to be so dramatic and dreadful when they die. And here's how I'll tell everyone. And then she's disappointed that she can't be the one to share the big news. And she doesn't even care what kind of news it is.
You've got to be psychopathic. Also, what really just stood out to me there as well is that she was disappointed that Edmund didn't want to share in the anxiety. She was like, why aren't you like sharing in these anxieties? I want you to feel terrible and awful and be worrying about this, because when I break the news, I want it to be impactful. I want you to
You feel my pain. Or why aren't you as sociopathic as me?
It's so true. She just wants everyone to be miserable. And then she also is disappointed too when Sir Thomas comes back and she isn't the one to announce it. She has some kind of like...
You're just going to say she's disappointed when Sir Thomas comes back.
He's alive.
Oh, yeah. That's probably it. Yeah. Oh my gosh. I'm like very glad we talked about this, because that is the obsessive neurotic fantasies about them dying and her telling everyone number one creep factor.
Wow. That. I'm just blown away.
I'm laughing, but laughing because of disbelief, and also because, again, of Izzy's facial reactions, because it's just awful. Like it's just, yeah.
I can't cope.
I know. It's a lot. I don't even know, where were we with the...
Wow, I mean...
I'm shook.
Something else that I'm just going to throw this out here. I mean, I don't think there's any redeeming Mrs. Norris at this point. And this isn't going to redeem her either, but I just think it's really interesting as well how it represents like these two kind of like more matriarchal figures in this position. These are women that could hold a certain amount of power. I know Mrs. Norris doesn't have necessarily the status and the wealth, but she perceives herself above Fanny, and so does in a sense have power over Fanny, as Lady Catherine has power over all the people in her parish and everything. But the way that they use that power is so different. Like, I know Lady Catherine, it doesn't always come across with the best intentions, because she's always got like a bit of a backhanded comment on it. But she does want to help. She wants to provide. She speaks her truth about her thoughts on like women's education and women distinguishing themselves and having talents and skills. Like, she is a bit of a feminist at the end of the day, let's be clear.
Yeah.
Very early wave feminism, okay? Yeah, she's not delved into it too much, but she's
very conservative and like high feminist. So I completely. I mean, who wouldn't want shelves? Who wouldn't want shelves in the closet? I mean, come on, Mrs. Norris didn't do any of that.
Exactly. Really, Mrs. Norris's biggest downfall is that she doesn't put shelves in anyone's closets. Let's be clear.
No redeeming qualities here at all.
So happy with how many times shelves in the closet has come up. It makes me
so you have to. If we're talking about Lady Catherine, it's got to come up.
We need all these happy thoughts when we're talking about Mrs. Norris. Jeez.
Yeah.
I know. I so agree with you though, where Lady Catherine is annoying and controlling about it, but I think she makes promises to help people and then she follows through on them. Whereas, oh my gosh, Mrs. Norris goes out of her way to make promises to people, and then she ends up not following through, but then inconveniencing other people and like using their resources, their time, their energy, but then somehow still takes credit for the gesture, even though she's not putting herself out at all.
Yeah, I think nobody actually knows what her true motives are, right? she's saying one thing, but really what she's thinking is something entirely different. I mean, think of how dark it got when she thought that they were going to die when they were on the trip. I mean, all of her thoughts are clearly that dark. Or the fact that her husband died, she wasn't sad at all. She's really psychotic, let's be clear. And Lady Catherine's such a woman of action as well. Like, she's got a problem with Elizabeth. She's rocking up and she's like sorting that situation out. You know, there's an issue with a cottage down the road. She's going to sort it. There's a closet with no shelves. She will sort that. She's on it. But like Mrs Norris, what does she actually do? Like, the only thing I can see her doing is being horrible to Fanny. What else does she does a bit of matchmaking with Mr. Rushworth, but Maria doesn't even want to be with Mr. Rushworth, and that's all still for her own motive. What does she does no selfless act at all.
Not at all. And she, in the gaslighting that happens with her too, like she truly convinces Sir Thomas that, oh, no, I was never going to take Fanny on. Like, she will convince people that she didn't make those promises. And I just think that's really wrong. And I do think Lady Catherine, like when she says, okay, my man will attend you as you're going back, as Lizzie's going back, I think she would follow through on that. I think she would have different gestures to help, whereas Mrs. Norris's level of manipulation and she's very, very selfish. Yeah.
I think Lady Catherine is through and through a woman's woman. Like, I feel like even the thing with Darcy, it's not about Darcy. That's about her daughter, 100%. That's why she doesn't really mention Darcy, but it's literally just like, no, this was something I had planned for my daughter. You are messing up my plans.
That's so true. That's a good point.
Mrs. Norris
so again, she's standing up for herself and her daughter, and like you say, actually being a woman's woman. But who's Mrs. Norris benefiting other than herself?
Mrs. Norris is Mrs. Norris's woman.
Just Mrs. Norris, yeah. There is no one else involved in her agenda.
Yeah, that's so true. And actually, that makes me think about the fact that even though Lady Catherine is really obnoxious, there are times where I have compassion for her. Like, I do think, even though it's very creepy, they're planning their wedding when they're in their cribs. I could imagine if you get attached to an idea where it's, oh, my best friend's son is going to marry my daughter, and if you get attached to something like that, and then you see that you're
like with the historical context of that time, like, that was probably quite a natural thing to do, and the whole fact that then he would be provided for with, like, you know, a good and wealthy, and well, I know they've got wealth, but he's a good social standing, like, man, you know, he'll be able to protect and look after all of that. You know, she wants to make sure her daughter's going to be well looked after and provided for.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
generational wealth is, you know, I mean, that's
in the family.
They want to keep it in the family.
It's weird, but exactly. They want to keep it in the family.
Yeah. I mean, it is creepy when you put it in a modern context. It's weird. It's literally like, what you're doing, like, because then you're just taking feeling out of it, which is the same issue that Mrs. Norris has. You know, when you look at relationships and marriage, everything, when you take feeling completely out of it, it's all about money and status and position, then it's disturbing, particularly for us as a modern audience. But obviously there was people of the time, as we know, that also found it disturbing, because not everybody's avoid a feeling.
The one time Mrs. Norris is quieter and doesn't have something to say is when she finds out that Henry proposed to Fanny, and then she's very upset, and you find out the reason she's upset is that she wanted Henry to propose to Julia, and it was a slight to Julia, and she really dehumanizes Fanny and what Fanny might be going through in that moment. Like, Fanny is bad, anyone with wealth is good, whereas I feel like it's very human that, you know, the fact that Lady Catherine's daughter, Anne, is so sick, like, there is humanness in that. I bet she has a lot of disappointment that her daughter can't do all of the normal things that other women can do, and won't have the same opportunities to marry well.
Who else will Anne be marrying at the end of the day? That was probably her last hope, is that she would be able to marry Darcy. Is there anything else that we want to add? Shall we get into, like, picking who's worse? I think it's pretty obvious, but we can still debate it, I suppose.
I wanted to hear your thoughts about the fact that Mrs. Norris leaves with Maria.
Yes. Oh, yes. Let's talk about this, because that. Oh, also, can I just say I love it that nobody's sad that she leaves. Like, there's actually quotes in the book where it says that no one was sad that Mrs. Norris left. I was like, that's so funny.
Party. Hooray!
Yes, and she chooses to be with Maria, even though Maria is, you know, being shamed in is probably going to end up divorced because Mr. Rushworth could definitely afford to do that in that time. It's difficult, but I'd say of all the people, he would be able to do that. Bad times. Yeah, and she chooses to go with Maria. So is her feelings for Maria, is her love for Maria as her niece genuine? Mega upset that Mariah's cut off. Like, she thinks Maria deserves a second chance. Mariah's pretty much screwed up the match that she made, and she still wants to be with Maria. That's not selfish.
Yeah.
Guilt coming out? I don't know.
See, I'd say she shouldn't have guilt, but I'm not
without
sure.
knowing it. I don't know. But obviously we're kind of obviously projecting our emotions onto her. I wonder what the purpose or what the intention was behind Jane Austen writing.
I just had a thought. Maybe it's, how we were saying that she's like obsessed with being around people who are miserable. Maybe she was like, I need to be with Maria because she's like miserable and it's like disturbing. Whereas like Fanny and Edmund are going to get married, everyone's going to be happy. She's like, I can't live in happiness.
Things happening here. I need to go.
I have to go and I have to dwell in Mariah's suffering. I have to feel her suffering. And if I can, make her suffer more.
Oh my God. Yeah, I'm just like, I just, that part really didn't make sense to me because I'm like, she is, character-wise, she would not do something, like, that does seem like a selfless act, right? Like, to follow Mariah. And does she have guilt because she pushed Mr. Rushworth on her so much? Does she actually care for her? And she probably doesn't. Do you think that she can't stand that Fanny and Edmund would be together and then Fanny would be in the same or even better social standing? Is it more that she less about caring about Mariah and more about not being able to withstand Fanny rising up?
Still picking her best option. And what's her best option? Does she want to live with Fanny when Fanny marries Edmund, or does she want to live with Mariah?
Yeah, maybe she's avoiding the fact that actually once Fanny becomes like into her, or by marrying Edmund, she's suddenly got a much better social position. She could quite easily maybe get rid of Mrs. Norris. So before she can turn around and start like having her getting her own back, I don't know, she leaves the situation, and maybe it's because Mariah's the only person who's giving her attention as well and being thankful for like, you give me so much, whereas Fanny never gave her any thanks. But I don't know why she would anyway, because it was awful. But I don't know, maybe it's that sort of twisted need, like you say, for attention mixed. If you can cope with Fanny then actually becoming an established part of the Burton family.
Yes, status-wise, Fanny would then be above Mrs. Norris. Yeah, I don't think Fanny would be malicious. I think Fanny's quite a forgiving person. I think Edmund would if she said anything to Fanny from that point. And I didn't think she'd be able to help herself.
Yeah, and because Mrs. Norris is so awful, she probably thinks other people are capable of being awful as well, even if they're not.
Yeah, she's projecting how she
would react.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sounds right. I think she didn't want to be around Fanny and Edmund. Mariah is going to give her the most attention and make her feel important. And then maybe there's a very small shred of her that actually cares for Mariah a little bit. But then when I think about the sociopathic part where she wanted them to die for attention, I'm like, nah.
Terrifying. Absolutely terrifying. Okay. Okay. Right. I reckon we wrap it up. So, you know what my final thoughts on it are? I think Lady Catherine does have some baddish qualities that do make her a bit villainy. However, I feel like Mrs. Norris is a really great villain and a really important character. Like, I feel like Mansfield Park's such a grey book in terms of morals, like it's really grey. But I feel like Fanny and Mrs. Norris, don't you think they're like the bracket for that like precept? Like, Fanny's one end of the spectrum, Mrs. Norris is the other. I don't think the text could survive without Mrs. Norris, like it couldn't survive without Fanny. Like, I mean, it will survive without Fanny, but that's another conversation. But like, the two of them need that, like they need that, like that opposition, right? Whereas Pride and Prejudice could probably survive without Lady Catherine. So I feel like Mrs. Norris is the worst villain, more because she's so significant to us liking Fanny, you know, Fanny's journey, like Fanny's development. If it was like a coming of age book, Mrs. Norris would be so significant to that I'm like, I feel like she's the worst villain because she's so significant, because she's such a polar opposite to the heroine.
That is such a good point. I never thought of Mrs. Norris as a main character, but she is. You can't have Mansfield Park without her. Whereas theoretically you could have Pride and Prejudice without Lady Catherine. Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And I think Mrs. Norris is the worst of the two in so many ways, because she is hypocritical. She doesn't show empathy. She promises things, doesn't follow through. But what I will say is I do think Lady Catherine rises to her level somewhat in that fight with Elizabeth, where she says, "Are the shades of Pemberley to be thus polluted?" She, even if it's coming from a place of being sad for her own daughter, like what she says to Elizabeth is really mean-spirited and unacceptable. So,
yeah. I think you've both definitely hit the nail on the head there. In terms of, I think the fact of the plot, I think, couldn't exist without Mrs. Norris in Mansfield Park. Maybe not a main character. Mrs. Norris is throughout the book. Lady Catherine comes up when she's needed to sort of drive it forward, and also just because she is, I think, an amazing character. Like, I think she's actually quite a funny character. Like, people, celebrate her today for those one-liners, the things that she comes out with, they're horrible, but I think there's more of that comedic element to it sometimes. Whereas Mrs. Norris, like you say, is just horrific and bad and does not think of anything other than herself and really wants to hurt. I think she wants to, like I say, bully her and hurt her. And like you say, the similarities are that, yes, I think they've both got a lot of obsession with money, status, class, all of those things. They both obviously hold very high in their thoughts. They both say really horrible things. They're quick to judge people, to tell people what they should do, to manipulate people. All of those things are pretty similar. But as I say, I think Mrs. Norris is definitely the worst out of the two because of the way she targets Fanny, the things she says. Again, both of them have maybe not the best intention. I think, like you say, with Lady Catherine, there are some quite cool elements to her in the fact, like you say, she does come across a little bit like an early feminist, standing up for herself and making sure she does what she wants, but she is making sure that her actions are done. She is a woman of purpose, and like you said, Izzy. And then, like you're saying, Kelly, with Mrs. Norris, she is just, I don't even think there's
evil.
She's just evil. She's just awful, and she's got sociopathic.
No redeeming characteristics.
No redeeming qualities, I think, in what she does. And I think for me, Mrs. Norris is the worst out of the two. I mean, she genuinely scared Izzy earlier in this episode, so
I'm terrified. I am like, wow, Halloween is here. It's in the form of Mrs. Norris. I don't think I can go back out in society just in case I bump into somebody like that.
Oh my gosh, that's so true about that. Like Mrs. Norris is like watching a horror film, whereas Lady Catherine, sometimes you roll your eyes, but it is more comedic relief. Like, she's so absurd, you just laugh at things that she says, and you're not so, it's not cringe. It's not like a haunted house that you can never get out of.
Yeah. You're not scared of it. Like, when Elizabeth first walks into the room, like Sir William, Lucas and Mariah, they're like just shocked into silence because they're like terrified. They're like, oh my gosh, it's Lady Catherine. Whereas Elizabeth's like, does not have that effect on me. It's fine. She's like, this is actually kind of funny, this whole thing. I'm just going to roll with it.
It's almost like a facade, isn't it, with Lady Catherine? Almost, it is very much an act. But I think with Mrs. Norris, that is her genuine character. It's like deep rooted, the fact that she's really horrible and not nice. Where I think with Lady Catherine, it's a mixture of her upbringing, who she thinks she is, and this facade to have to look and act like she's got authority, and it almost goes too far. Whereas with Mrs. Norris, she's just got, it's deep rooted in her, this horrible ability to want to, all her past traumas onto someone else, I think, is what maybe a therapist would say. Who knows?
Yeah, ask Kaylee. Kaylee, was that, how would you diagnose that?
How would you diagnose? Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, I wouldn't take her as a client.
Yeah.
She definitely has narcissistic tendencies, and she is definitely sociopathic. I would put her, I could diagnose her with a lot of different things, but she's got something going on.
Yeah, she's got something going on for sure. She's going to give me nightmares. I don't watch the news because the news upsets me. So Mrs Norris is disturbing me on so many levels. Now we're unpacking
Isn't Jane Austen supposed to give us like, light relief and all of this?
I was like, come on, guys, come on for a fun Friday night. Let's talk about this. And we're like, Mrs Norris, terrifying.
Yes, you have not really understood Jane Austen unless you know about Mrs Norris. It is not all comfort reading and lovely romantic story.
Well, I'm shocked into silence. Mrs Norris is the winner of Villainesses 2023, everybody. I think eventually we should do go back and do all the winners. Yeah. We'll start pairing the winners off.
Yeah, we need to
we'll get one true villain. And I guess we'll see who we do next year, guys. Who knows? If you've got any suggestions, please leave them below. If you have any thoughts on Lady Catherine, Mrs Norris, if you disagree with us in any way, let us know. On Spotify, there's actually a Q&A section, so you can add any thoughts and ideas on there. I do check that out. And also, obviously, on Instagram, DM us and put some posts on this so you can share on there as well. But yeah, we'd love to hear from you. But that's everything from us today. Alice, do you want to let everyone know where they can find you?
Yeah, thank you. That was so much fun. I know it was a horror film review, but also it was super fun just to dissect those characters. So thank you both for having me on and discussing. It was a really, really great conversation, and I'd love to hear people's thoughts on it too. So if you want to get in touch with me or look at my page, I am at historian_Ellis, ELLIS on Instagram. So I post a lot on there about Jane Austen, obviously, but also lots of kind of historical context because I sort of a historian by trade, we'll say.
Elle is a historian. Say it loud, say it proud.
I am a historian. Yeah, it's that what imposter syndrome, isn't it, or whatever it is. Yeah. But yeah, so please do find me on there. It'd be great to have you and talk more about Jane Austen's villain.
I love it, Kaylee.
Yeah, I just wanted to say too, this was so fun to get the three of us back together. And Alice, I love when you bring the historical context in. There's so many new things that I learn when you do that. And I love that so much. So yeah, I can't wait till our next one. What was the question? Oh, where to find me? So I'm on Instagram, _Agony, _hope. And yeah, you can find me there and love to hear all your thoughts from the podcast.
We love it. And obviously, Elle and Kaylee have been on loads of other episodes, which I will tag down below so that you can find all of those, including the first Villainesses, which was all three of us, the second one that was just me and Kaylee. But yeah, you'll be able to find all of that below. And yeah, that's everything from me. If you want to find me, I'm on Instagram at @WhatTheAusten, where I share all updates on the podcast and also other posts as well. And if you want to join the book club, you'll have to join the Patreon. So yeah, we have a Patreon book club, and at the moment we are still on Pride and Prejudice, but we will be wrapping that up soon. So if you want to join us for the next book, then yeah, make sure that you're signing up for that because we're having a lot of fun and it's a really great group. So yeah, we'd love to have you over there. That's everything from us today, and we will see you in another episode.